Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Kelly, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
And I'm Kelli Saunders, joining you again today in place of Sarah Miller. I'm the Executive Advisor and Director of Office Administration here at SBM. Sarah's entrusted me once again to fill her shoes, so I will try to do that well. We want to make sure to thank our sponsor for today's briefing, Consumers Credit Union. Make sure to visit their website at consumercu.org to know more about how they can best support your small business needs. So, Brian, we have a few things to talk about today, but let's start with workforce and unemployment numbers that came out today. Looks like there's some good news, but there might be a catch. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, every time I talk about the unemployment rate itself, which is what was released today, so the state-based unemployment rate, which is 3.8%. 3.8% is what it was immediately before the pandemic. So February of 2020. So it's back to that point. We also saw in today's numbers the year over year there was an increase in overall labor force participation. So April of 2023 was higher than April of 2022. So again, good news. So both of these things, good news. However, since the unemployment, the labor force participation is still lagging. It's up from a year ago, but still lagging pre-pandemic times. There's a lot of demand, not as many people in the labor force. So that means that the unemployment rate being lower doesn't mean as much as it did in the past. So when there's more people in the labor force and the rate is lower, that's great. If there's fewer people in the labor force and the rate is lower, well, part of the reason it's lower is because there's fewer people in the labor force. So that's it's one of those things where it's good news. I look at it as all good news, but the caveat is that we still have a long way to go when it comes to getting the size and girth of our workforce here in Michigan back to pre-pandemic levels, when it was still at very low overall labor force participation compared to what the top economic performing states are at.
Let's continue to talk about a little bit of numbers and dive into population then. So we did see some census numbers come back regarding cities. We've been talking and ringing the alarm bell a little bit on population for a while here in Michigan, as our population tends to be a little bit older. Can you tell us about the numbers regarding cities around the United States?
Yeah, the census is always coming out with updates, and they do annually. They do updates. There's the big census every 10 years, but there's lots of updates that happen in the meantime. With cities in particular, when the pandemic hit, there was a pretty big exodus from cities, especially the biggest cities. Places like New York and San Francisco were the biggest losers around the country. What this most recent update from the census shows, though, is that in most big cities, the population has really settled in. So if you were to look at all the cities, well, I'll say to the top 10, all but one either has started to grow again or is, I should say, compared to the 2020 year when city population fell. So either stabilized or started to grow again, all but Philadelphia. So generally a good sign that the population drain on major cities seems in 2022 to have tempered compared to what it was in 2020 and 2021.
So let's talk about our biggest city, Detroit. What did we see there?
Yeah, and so the city of Detroit itself, which on national standards is not really considered to be like a big city. It's our big city, but it doesn't come anywhere near the top 10. In fact, it did fall a few spaces. It's the 29th largest city in the country. It was in 2021. It was 27th. So Louisville and Memphis both moved in the last year. Have both moved past Detroit in overall population. And unfortunately, it is one of the cities that has continued to lose population. The city of Detroit did challenge the census numbers. They put the population at 620,376 Detroiters, and the city did challenge that. Just a very modest adjustment that was made afterwards, but really, I know that the city and leadership of the city is quite disappointed with that final determination. So looking at it and just raw numbers, it's a loss of about 8,000 people. So the city shrank 8,000 people from 2021 to 2022, and putting that in percentage wise down 2.67% from the previous year.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some legislative items. We have talked about the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act before. Governor Whitmer had signed legislation earlier this year. There's been another change to that act. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act is a non-discrimination act, and it's been around, well, about as long as I've been alive. And so this act is one that affects mainly employment and housing. So it doesn't allow for discrimination in employment decisions would be the main thing that our audience would be paying attention to. You might recall that there's always been a prohibition in Michigan in this act against discrimination of somebody based on sex. So that was always in the past determined to be male and female based on somebody being a male or female. The Supreme Court changed that to include or reinterpreted, I should say, to say that actually covers issues of sexual preference, gender identity, basically LGBTQ prohibition is inherent in the act as it stood. The legislature then codified that Supreme Court decision in Michigan's legislation. So that's what has happened so far. So that's already in the law. What just passed and hit the governor's desk with her signature is a prohibition of discrimination against a person based on them having an abortion. So this is another discrimination prohibition added into that act. I hadn't really heard about any cases. I'm not really sure what drove the change to be made. I hadn't heard of any kind of like landmark cases or something kind of working through or suggesting that there were discrimination. But employers should know that that the protections within the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act have been expanded as such.
Let's switch to the House and Senate for a moment and talk about the House and Senate fiscal agencies. They have recently released their projections ahead of the revenue estimating conference that will be tomorrow. What are we seeing in those numbers and what should we expect?
Yeah, the House Fiscal, let's talk about the House Fiscal first. And what's happening is the House Fiscal puts out their estimates for next year. They do this every May, and they do it just ahead of final passage of the state's budget. Our Constitution requires that the state budget be balanced. What are they balancing to? Well, they balance to the consensus revenue estimates. The consensus revenue estimates are made up of three parts: House Fiscal Agency, the Senate Fiscal Agency, and Treasury representing the governor. So those three entities have to agree on exactly what the revenues are next year so that they can build their budget off that. That is constitutional, required for a balanced budget. The House Fiscal Agency, they put out their numbers day before yesterday, and their estimates are lowering the numbers from last January. So they do this in January, and then they update in May before the final passage. Those revenue estimates are moving down by $2.4 billion. It's a pretty big downward adjustment. And it is a downward adjustment in the general fund because the school aid fund, actually, they are projecting a modest increase in the school aid fund revenues. And if you were to look at and by the way, that number is spread between current and next year. So it's looking at like where we're at today and what's going to come in this year and where we're going to close this year and what's projected for next year. So you have to keep in mind what this actually means for the budget. It could be quite disruptive because the governor presented a budget in February, a budget request to the legislature. So that proposed budget spent the $9 billion surplus. So the state had $9 billion in surplus that came from just higher revenues coming into the state for a variety of reasons, and a bunch of federal money that had come into the state as well. So there was this big surplus. The governor's budget did spend it down to basically nothing. And so now, as the House and the Senate have both passed budgets, they were mainly based on the January numbers. And if the consensus revenue estimates are 2.4 billion less, well, it's still going to be probably the largest or near largest state budget in history. But and a lot of people, that's how the government works, is that if you have to cut down on the increase that they request, they can sometimes describe that as cuts. So keep your ear open for that. You might hear people talk about cuts in state government. It's not in the sense that the private sector would consider, or not the same definition the private sector would have on cuts. Now, almost all of the downward revision is due to changes in tax policy. So most of those changes in tax policy have been on the income tax, and the income tax is the biggest revenue generator for our general fund. So a little bit goes to the school aid fund. School aid fund is mainly sales tax, also includes the lottery profits as well. But the big changes that have been made, there was an earmark put into the income tax bill of $600 million for the next 3 years into the SOAR fund, or the big business incentive pot, if you will. So that was not included in January's numbers, so that revised it down. There was a very, very big increase in the earned income tax credit as well. And so that revised the income tax numbers down. There were pretty big expansions in the retiree exemptions, so that revised the numbers down further. And then on the individual income tax, that automatic rollback, even though we still expect to have to battle keeping that rate down, it will go down at least for 1 year, and that's another $600 million. So you add all of those things up, and you see where the downward revision in the general fund came from. Now the numbers from the Senate were not terribly far off from the House. So that's a little different than in January. In January, the Senate and the House seem to have very different revenue estimates, but the Senate Fiscal shows it down 2.2 billion, and the House was 2.4 billion. Now, that's a $200 million difference. I'm from a little town called Portland. 200 million is still a lot of money to me. But in terms of like the state budget, where it's going to be over $80 billion, it's a fairly minor difference between these two revenue estimates. And the Senate, I think, concurred. Generally, the downward revision was due to changes in tax policy, but then also they're not projecting the type of growth in the future that they've had in the past, because again, a lot of that growth was kind of artificially bolstered by federal dollars that really have run their course at this point and are not expected to sustain.
Well, we will for sure keep our eye on this, and we'll look forward to your evaluation on Monday after the revenue estimating conference happens tomorrow. But as a reminder, it is budget season here in Lansing, so we will see what happens after this all comes out between the governor's office and the House and the Senate to see if there are any changes as we move forward. Let's move into a piece of legislation that moved out of the Senate Energy and Environment Committee called No More Strict Than Federal. Can you talk about that and what that means and where it might be going as it proceeds?
Yeah, so this is one that has been on our list of concerns for anybody who has dealt with the department EGLE, formerly DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. It's there, when it comes to environmental rules, we have had a policy for a number of years in Michigan in statute that says that we will not establish rules, will not make rules here in Michigan that exceed the federal rules, and without of course, the state can always pass a law, a statute to go beyond federal rules. But in terms of when our state bureaucracy is making rules, they can't go beyond the federal standards. It really does look like, this looks to me like it has some legs, like a repeal of this restriction on the environmental bureaucracy in Michigan. Looks like it really could maybe go the distance to make it through the process. So one that we're watching closely. Naturally, some businesses care more about this than others. Anybody who's ever had to get a permit from the DEQ or Eagle Department of Energy, Environment, and Great Lakes and Environment. That I might have that acronym all wrong. It's Eagle, they call it Eagle. Probably Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, actually, I think is the acronym. So, but anybody who's had to get a department permission for something, an answer, a permit issued, a permission out of that department, knows why that rule exists. It's one that does tend to, there tends to be mission creep. There tends to be a lot of obstacles in making good things happen from a business perspective in Michigan. And so this policy has really moderated some of the tendencies historically in that department. So we'll keep you posted as this one may start working through the system. It's across the first hurdle, which was passing out of Senate committee.
Let's switch to some campaign finance reports. We had a quarterly filing come up at the end of April, a chance to see where people are investing their political dollars. We see unions playing at a higher level than they have in a long time. What does that mean for us moving forward?
Kind of eye-popping numbers. Bridge Michigan, the news organization Bridge Michigan, did an analysis of the campaign finance report from June 1st to April 30th. That's the period that was covered in the most recent filing. During that time period, $657,900 in contributions made to lawmakers and then accounts associated with the governor on the Democratic side of the aisle. And so, looking over that time period, you see right to work pass, you see prevailing wage reinstated, right to work was repealed, prevailing wage was reinstated. There's been proposals to make union dues tax deductible, so essentially the taxpayers pay the union dues for union members. And then also there's another proposal working its way through the system now that would allow for public bodies like governments to collect union dues out of government employee paychecks and remit them to the unions. And then some of the issues that we were more concerned about, things like limitations on independent contractors, things like pay disclosure, having to essentially publish within your company the pay that everybody makes, and then predictive scheduling, not really requiring 2 weeks notice on a schedule and requiring double time if you change it, double time payments to employees. These are all things that that fall within that union set of issues, the umbrella of issues. And in a lot of cases, with smaller businesses, it means getting the government in between the employer and the employee. And this is one of our core issues. We like for the government to stay out of that relationship as much as possible. And when that was kind of compiled and published by Bridge Michigan, it was kind of eye-popping, but you can see why there's so much attention that is being paid. That there's a lot of things that we do need to be concerned about when it comes to the business climate in Michigan. We started out this broadcast talking about unemployment is down, workforce is finally starting to edge up, and we know there's other reasons for that. We know inflation is high, credit card debt is starting to increase. When we look at the national numbers, people that had maybe taken some time off work and are now kind of getting back into the workforce. There are a lot of things about our economy that look really solid right now. And a lot of these changes are things that we want it to stay solid. We don't want to do anything to soften it and harm entrepreneurs and them making investments, taking risks. in the future. So, but with that level of, since I've been involved, I've never seen those kind of contributions coming right out of an election. It'd be one thing if we were right on an election, but like we just got done with an election, that dropping $650,000 into accounts in just a few months to start out a cycle is, it's like I said, it was a pretty eye-popping number to see.
Well, to your point, it does seem like election cycles are never ending at this time. So we will definitely continue to watch those types of activities and keep you updated. One of our final topics we want to talk about today is Attorney General Nessel has been back in the news regarding Line 5. So let's get an update on what she has been saying.
Yeah, there is so the state, the Attorney General on behalf of the state of Michigan, filed an amicus brief, which is like weighing in an opinion on somebody else's lawsuit. So the efforts to close down Line 5, which is what delivers oil from Canada to refineries that serve the Midwest, including Michigan. Michigan probably the one that depends mostly on Line 5 in terms of our consumers and of things like gasoline. The efforts in Michigan to try to close it down have really stalled. So that we were pretty pleased and have really urged the Army Corps of Engineers to issue the final permit to put the pipeline in a dry tunnel underneath the Straits of Mackinac, as opposed to on the bottomlands where it exists today. But others just want to close it down entirely. There was a lawsuit that was filed in Wisconsin, and that is by the Bad River Band of the Lake Superior Tribe of the Chippewa Indians of the Bad River Reservation. They filed an emergency shutdown request of the pipeline. And as you go through their filing, what they're saying is that the pipeline runs near a river. The river has experienced significant erosion. If it eroded a bunch more, that it could undermine the footings of the pipeline and it could cause a rupture or something. There was no attempt within the lawsuit to demonstrate it, like to say, here's why we believe that. It really seemed to be based on this idea of like, if this and this and this and this and this and this happens, then it could cause a problem. And but honestly, it didn't have serious independent structural kind of engineering input into the process. It's an activist lawsuit. Unfortunately, the state did weigh in to support the shutdown based on the claims that were made in that suit. So at this point, we're just keeping an eye on it. I still think that issue it won't go any further or have any more legs in Wisconsin than it had here in Michigan, because it's kind of like what if a Michigan citizen or an American citizen had an investment in asset that they paid for and had the permits for, and it was legal in Canada, and a government within Canada said, no, we're just going to seize that from you. Like, that would cause big problems. It would violate treaties. It would be something that really just couldn't stand. And that's one of the reasons why the frivolous lawsuits in Michigan really haven't made it anywhere. I expect that would probably be the same in Wisconsin. So we'll keep an eye on it, because again, Michigan does rely as much or more than anybody on Line 5, our citizens do. But it's hopefully going to meet the same fate as all the other efforts to try and close it down here in Michigan in the past.
Okay, well, that's all we have for you today. I want to thank you for joining the Small Business Briefing. Sarah will be back on Monday alongside Brian. We hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Monday.